Topic note 6.2, coral reef formation and distribution. And this is a picture of elkhorn coral in the Florida Keys because, of course, we live right next to one of the largest barrier reefs in the world. And we're going to learn all about it in this set of notes. Now, here are the main ideas. Coral reefs are formed by cnidarians, which of course we've learned already earlier in the year, with a mutualistic relationship with dinoflagellates called zooxanthellae. Now, coral reefs require specific abiotic conditions to grow and are found primarily in tropical regions. Let's start off with the basic question. What is a reef? A reef is traditionally defined as a chain of rocks or coral under the surface of the water, and it provides shelter and surface area for marine life to live. And so we generally kind of pin the term reef onto corals. However, there are all sorts of different types of reefs that we can find globally. Some of them are not even in tropical waters. Some of them are built by oysters, for example, or limestone boulders, or what have you. However, we are going to be focusing mostly on the coral variety of reefs. Now, this may be a bit of a recap, but corals are animals in phylum Cnidaria, and of course, their major characteristic would be stinging cells. Now, coral reefs are built entirely by biological activity, essentially the deposition of calcium carbonate, CaCO3. Now, stony corals are the primary depositors of this calcium carbonate. However, there are others, including calcareous algae that secrete, again, calcium carbonate. Now, only corals found in tropical regions build these large coral reefs. We do have what we call ahermatypic corals, or non-reef building corals, that live in other parts of the world or in deeper water, but the hermatypic corals are the ones that build those big coral reefs. We can differentiate between two major types of coral, what we call hard coral and soft coral. Now, hard coral is that stony coral that's capable of reef building that has that relationship with zooxanthellae. Now, there are hard corals that are not reef building and that do not have relationship with zooxanthellae. However, again, in this particular context in these notes, we're going to focus mostly on those reef building corals and those hard corals. An example of that on the bottom left is staghorn coral, but you've also probably seen some like star coral or brain coral. Those are those really calcifying large reef building corals. Now, we also have what we call soft corals, and those do not build reefs and lack calcification. They use essentially a type of protein for support. An example of that is on the bottom right there. You'll see the sea fan, and they wave around. They're very flexible. Let's take a look at stony coral anatomy, specifically the polyp. And this is, again, one of those organisms you may be required or asked to do a biological drawing of. Now, the polyp itself is the non-moving cup-like life stage of the cnidarian. And in this particular instance with coral, it's the major life stage, unlike, for example, a jellyfish where it's more of the medusa stage most of its life. Now, calcium carbonate skeletons are secreted by the lower portion of the polyp, and we can define a couple of pieces of that lower portion. The entirety of it is called the calyx, which is the stony coral cup in which the coral polyp lives its life. Now, out of that, you can break down the basal plate, or the lower part of the coral calyx that separates the polyp from the substrate, and then the theca. The theca is the wall of the calyx, essentially the vertical wall of it. And so the polyp kind of sits in there, but remember that the polyp actually secretes the calcium carbonate of the calyx and the theca and the basal plate, essentially. So as the coral grows, those parts continue to be secreted and the polyp kind of rises and the entire coral colony gets larger. For reproduction, we'll talk specifically about stony corals, and they are either dioecious or hermaphroditic, and they release gametes into the water. So they go through what we call external fertilization. So essentially, egg and sperm get out into the water, they meet somewhere, hopefully through chance, and fertilize each other externally. Then we have the planula larvae, and they will attach themselves to some sort of hard substrate that's clean and clear. That's where you get all the grazers like urchins and things that help keep bare rock around. And then they form the first polyp. And through that, we go into asexual processes where we have budding and cloning that starts to create the coral colony itself. So when you see a coral colony or what we would like, oh, look, that star coral, that brain coral, that's essentially a colony that has been reproducing asexually. Now, for nutrition, there are sort of two categories with corals. There's those who primarily feed only on zooplankton, which they use their stinging cells, their ctenocytes, to sting the zooplankton and bring it into their mouths and actually feed, right? That's the one category. And of course, corals can also absorb dissolved organic matter to supplement nutrients. Now, when we talk about reef-building corals, we often refer to them as hermatypic corals, and those are the corals that have a mutualistic relationship with zooxanthellae algae. Now, about 90% of the hermatypic or reef-building corals have this, and zooxanthellae is that symbiotic photosynthetic dinoflagellate that lives within the tissues of many invertebrates, and specifically hard corals. Now, this relationship is really important to understand, and we are actually still trying to understand it as scientists. Now, what we know so far is that the zooxanthellae provide food for the coral. That seems obvious, right? They go through photosynthesis and they provide glucose and amino acids, and often by a byproduct, they have oxygen that's being provided. They also remove CO2 because that's, again, part of the process of photosynthesis. Now, the coral, which is the animal part of this relationship, right? The coral provides essentially a shelter, a place to live for the zooxanthellae that's protected by, what do you think? The stinging cells, right? The corals are going through respiration. They're providing CO2, which is useful for photosynthesis, the process of photosynthesis. And it also produces nitrogenous waste. Now, being coral an animal, it produces that nitrogen waste, and that can be used directly by the zooxanthellae. Also remember that just because these stony corals have the zooxanthellae and that's a source of nutrients does not mean they still do not prey on zooplankton. They still do actively prey on zooplankton, especially at night. You'll see all their tentacles out going after that planktonic prey. Now, another thing to note too, that the color of coral is actually dictated by that presence of zooxanthellae. Without the zooxanthellae, essentially all you see is the calcium carbonate skeleton underneath, which makes the corals look very white. You may have already realized that coral reefs tend to be in tropical environments. Well, if you have, you're not wrong. Temperature is a bit of a limiting factor. Temperatures need to be between about 16 to 35 degrees Celsius or about 61 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Corals are healthier and grow faster between around 23 to 25 degrees Celsius, which is around 73 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the majority of coral reefs around the world are found between like the two 30-degree latitudes, right? 30 degree north, 30 degrees south. And if you look at the diagram or the image down below, you'll see the yellow areas are where you find coral reefs, and almost all of them tend to be in that zone. Now, there are a few exceptions. For example, Florida, we're a little bit above it, but that's because we have the Gulf Stream coming up. So those warm currents sometimes will push coral reefs a little farther north than they would normally be found. This also might seem like a no-brainer, but water depth is a consideration because these reef-building corals need to have sunlight because that symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae, right? The zooxanthellae, if they don't have access to sunlight, they're not going to be able to photosynthesize, and then you don't have the ball game. So the deeper you go, you lose light. And so generally, hermatypic corals can't grow deeper than the zooxanthellae can photosynthesize. And the fastest growth rate tends to occur in the first 20 meters of water depth. Similarly, water clarity can be an issue, right? Because if, again, the water's not clear, then the zooxanthellae can't get the sunlight it needs. And so any sort of reduced light penetration can decrease the growth and also stress the corals. Now, this can happen from a number of reasons. There can be an abundance of nutrients that can cause algae blooms. That is a big issue with some of our coastal regions, especially near a lot of development. Sedimentation can also occur. This is one reason why, naturally speaking, you don't tend to see as many coral reefs, even in the tropical zones, if you have a mouth of a river, for example. Although there are some, but it's a little harder for them. So that's part of it. But if you have man-made sedimentation by like construction, dredging, things like that, that can also affect corals. Marine plants also do help things. They can help trap sediments, especially in coastal regions like the Keys. The seagrass bed helps hold everything down. Corals also need a hard substrate to actually colonize, and that's a really important one. So any sort of area, even if it's in the right conditions in terms of you're in the tropics, it's warm, you got all those things. If you don't have a hard bottom for the coral, Planiella larvae to settle, and that's the picture you see on the bottom left there, that's a settled polyp that's actually starting to grow. And then they start going through asexual reproduction and continue to multiply polyps, and then they grow larger, but they have to have that substrate to start with. Now, from an artificial standpoint, we can actually put this in place by putting structures underwater, and that way coral polyps can actually grow, which is kind of neat as well. The other thing is salinity. Salinity is generally oceanic salinity. 32 to 35 parts per thousand is generally normal. They can't really handle anything that goes really fresh or even hypersaline, so it needs to be right there in that sweet spot. Let's turn our attentions to the different types of coral reefs. Now we have fringing reefs to start off with, and these are the reefs that are the closest to shore, and they surround often continental borders and land masses. They surround volcanic islands when they first start to emerge. They're essentially right next to the shoreline. They're either connected directly or separated by very narrow or shallow lagoons. They tend to be vulnerable to excess sedimentation and runoff from land because they're so close to the shoreline. So any human disturbances can be amplified there a little bit more. Now let's talk about barrier reefs. Now barrier reefs are a reef separated by a lagoon from the landmass in which it's associated. Now we talked about fringing reefs. They are essentially right at the margin of the land or a small slither of a lagoon. This is a much wider lagoon. If you take, for example, go down to the Florida Keys, to go out to the reef, you have to take a boat out about 4 or 5 miles. Same thing with the Great Barrier. In fact, there's a little bit more of a stretch there. So the reef is much farther away from the landmass. Now the lagoon is characteristically, it's sheltered, right? It's a shallow body of water. It has soft sediment along the bottom. And the lagoons are deeper and wider than fringing reef, any lagoon that you might see there. But you also have patch reefs that come into play here. Now, a patch reef is essentially a small isolated reef, usually located within the lagoon or of the barrier reef. So it's inland from there. And they provide lots of little habitats for all sorts of organisms. And it's a sheltered area because the main barrier reef is farther off, blocking all the main waves coming from the ocean. So you've got a lot of critical habitat there. Finally, we have atolls. Now, atoll is a coral reef of a somewhat circular shape with a lagoon in the center. These are generally associated with volcanoes. And this brings us to the Darwin-Dana-Daly theory of atoll formation. What is this big long name? This is a name derived from the scientists that actually put forth this theory, including one you may know, which is Charles Darwin, also famous for the theory of natural selection. But while he was out on his adventures across the globe looking at these different islands, he started to look at how they might have evolved over time, and here we go. So what we start with when we talk about atoll development and formation is you start with the formation of a volcano, where you have it emerge from the surface of the water and create a bit of an island. Now from there, you have a fringing reef that will begin to grow along the shoreline, just offshore of the island, creating a fringing reef around that island. Now the coral continues to grow, adding calcium carbonate, while the volcano over time starts to become dormant and subside and sink. It really isn't sinking, but it starts to subside. If the rate of subsistence is equal to the rate of growth, the fringing reef will become a barrier reef. How does that happen? So as the volcanic island subsides, or essentially starts to descend under the water, then the reef, the coral, continues to grow up, and it matches the rate at which the volcano is subsiding. And if it can do that, then you maintain the corals in that golden zone where it gets plenty of sunlight and it can continue to become a reef. And when that happens, you start to grow a gap between the shore of the island and the actual reef itself. Now we're left with essentially the island with a barrier reef system. Now, as the island continues to descend or subside, you start to lose the island completely. And in that case, you end up with a ring that is the atoll with a lagoon in the middle. Now, the interior of the lagoon persists due to usually high sedimentation rates that happen within that protected system. And the ring of coral is there. And a lot of times it forms a land area along with, coral along the outside of it. So you get a bit of a beach and things like that sometimes as well. It all depends. But that is essentially the theory of atoll formation, from the emergence of the volcano to the complete subsidence of the volcano and the formation of the atoll itself. Now, to confirm this subsidence theory that we essentially just talked about, scientists drilled into the limestone of coral atolls and eventually found volcanic rock, which makes sense because that was the basis of where they started to grow. An example of this is the Marshall Islands. They found volcanic rock under about 1,283 meters of limestone. That's 60 million years of coral growth, which is incredible. All right, that is it for today. Remember, coral reefs are formed by cnidarians with mutualistic relationships with a dinoflagellate called zooxanthellae, and coral reefs require specific abiotic conditions to grow and are found primarily in tropical regions. And of course, until next time, keep learning.